Hey guys, welcome back to Bridgewater Student Ministries. I hope that you had a great Easter, and I'm so glad that you are here today. We're starting a new series that we are calling Giants Must Fall. If you're familiar with the biblical account of David and Goliath, you know that in it, David defeats a mighty giant. And in this series, we're looking at some of the giants in our lives, the things that are big and scary, and they often end up getting in the way of the life that we want to live and that God has for us. We're going to talk about how we can find victory over those things and make sure that those giants fall. And today we're kicking it off talking about fear. Fear is one of those things that has a way of overtaking us and holding us back from the blessings of God and the joy that we want in our life. I went on a wilderness trip last October to Algonquin Provincial Park in Canada. We had 8 guys with 4 canoes and everything that we needed for a week in our backpacks. We had really good weather for October in Canada until the last 2 days of our trip. On the second to last day, it got rainy and it got cold. We had a decent amount of traveling to do that day, and it rained on and off, and the waves on the lakes as we paddled got much bigger than they had been the rest of the week. And after lunch that day, we came to Burt Island Lake. And as we looked out on this big lake we needed to cross, we could tell that we had a pretty difficult paddle ahead. It was the biggest lake of the trip, and as we were on shore with a strong wind blowing directly at us, directly in our face, we could see that some storm clouds were rolling in. So we put on our life jackets that we hadn't worn all week long. We got our rain jackets out. We made sure everyone knew which direction we were headed. We prayed together, and then we put into the water. Within maybe 20 minutes of paddling, it started to rain hard. It was so windy and so rainy that if Dan or I stopped paddling, we would either stay still or start moving backwards in a matter of seconds. I was in the front of the canoe, and the waves were big enough that I was getting some airtime coming off of them. And getting airtime as you crash off of waves is fun in a motorboat. It's a pretty different thing in a canoe that's powered by your arms. All of us were a little bit afraid in this storm. We weren't freaking out, but in fact, we actually had some fun paddling through it together. But there was a very real sense that we could get in some serious trouble if we tipped over in the middle of this lake. We were many miles from civilization and would have been set back in our trip if we had to stop for a downed canoe. Simply getting the canoe just a little bit sideways is all it would have taken to tip the canoe and end up in some choppy water. We had to choose to face our fears head on that day because there was simply no other way out. The only way out was through. But sometimes, fear can hold us back. Fear can hold us back from trying new things we might enjoy because we're afraid that we might fail at it. It can keep us from having a hard conversation that would improve a relationship. It can prevent us from meeting new people we might be good friends with, and so much more. Maybe you're afraid of that mean kid at school to speak out when someone is mistreated, or afraid of what others might think of you. Fear has a way of pushing out all of the good things in our life and leaving in their place a bunch of anxiety and worry and discomfort and darkness and negative thoughts. Sometimes when we read about people in the Bible who did great things, we assume that they had no fear, that they didn't struggle with being afraid like us normal people, right? But I want to take us to a passage of scripture where all of Jesus' disciples were very afraid. The men who later go on to be courageous for God and start the church were shaking in fear. Let's look at Matthew chapter 14 together. Immediately after this, Jesus insisted that his disciples get back into the boat and cross to the other side of the lake, while he sent the people home. After sending them home, he went up into the hills by himself to pray. Night fell while he was there alone. Meanwhile, the disciples were in trouble far away from land, for a strong wind had risen, and they were fighting heavy waves. About 3 o'clock in the morning, Jesus came toward them, walking on the water. When the disciples saw him walking on the water, they were terrified. In their fear, they cried out, "It's a ghost!" But Jesus spoke to them at once. "Don't be afraid," he said. "Take courage. I am here." Then Peter called to him, "Lord, if it's really you, tell me to come to you walking on the water." "Yes, come," Jesus said. So Peter went over the side of the boat and walked on the water toward Jesus. But when he saw the strong wind and the waves, he was terrified and began to sink. "Save me, Lord," he shouted. Jesus immediately reached out and grabbed him. "You have so little faith," Jesus said. "Why did you doubt me?" When they climbed back into the boat, the wind stopped. Then the disciples worshiped him. "You really are the Son of God," they exclaimed. It's interesting that in verse 22, it says that Jesus insisted that his disciples got into this boat. Being God and knowing everything, he knew that they would face this storm. He knew what was coming, and he insisted that they get into the boat. He apparently wanted them to face this situation, probably because he knew what it would teach them about fear and about faith. The disciples are terrified for their lives. They have been battling these big waves for hours, and they have not gotten to shore. They are tired. They are worried that they might never make it to shore. And then they see what they think is a ghost, and that seals the deal for them. There was a superstition at this time that spirits of the night brought disasters. And so the disciples probably thought that this ghost meant that they were going to wreck, that they were going down in this storm. Disciples are afraid for their lives because they value their lives. And so here's what you need to understand about fear. Fear shows up when the things we value are threatened. Fear shows us what we value and are therefore afraid of losing. The disciples are afraid of losing their lives because they value them, which is a really normal and good thing. Like, I hope you value your life. Fear is a God-given gift that can alert us to what we need to pay attention to. If we're in a life-threatening situation, our brains and our bodies will respond in a way that helps us preserve our lives. The problem comes when we listen to our fears more than we listen to what God says. The disciples had forgotten that Jesus was the one who sent them into this storm. They forgot that God himself was with them. Immediately before this, they saw Jesus feed over 5,000 people with 5 loaves of bread and 2 fishes. There's another account of Jesus calming a storm while they are in a boat in Matthew chapter 8, which likely occurred before this one, and not to mention a bunch of other miracles Jesus performed with them around. And so they have plenty of reason to trust that Jesus has the power to do something about this storm, and yet they are afraid. It's interesting to me that we aren't told that the disciples were praying as they rowed for hours in this storm. Maybe it's just left out by the writer, but I wonder if it's because as they are in this desperate situation, they neglected to ask God to do something about it. I don't know about you, but I know that I have found myself time and time again working so hard to get out of a bad situation, to fix something, to work on something that I'm afraid of, and after being at it for hours or even days, I realize I didn't one time take it to God. I didn't one time ask for his help. I think we are more like than unlike the disciples, and just like them in our fears, we can neglect to take them to God. Our fear shows us what we value and are afraid to lose. But here's the other thing we need to see about fear. The antidote to fear is faith. The solution to fear is not to get over it, to ignore it, or to deny it. The solution to fear is faith in something greater than your fear. Peter has enough faith to get out of the boat and walk on the water toward Jesus. But then he takes his eyes off of Jesus and he starts looking at the wind and the waves around him. He then becomes afraid again because he went back to placing his faith in his own ability. Peter has no ability whatsoever to walk on water, and so he should be afraid if he's left to his own resources. But he is walking toward Jesus, who had every ability to walk on water, and help Peter do the same. And so Peter should have put his faith in Jesus, but instead he put it in himself and he begins to sink. And thankfully, Jesus is there to rescue him. The solution to fear is faith. It's not rowing harder. It's not fixing it on your own. It's faith. Jesus tells the disciples to take courage when they see him walking toward them on the water. And here's what we need to understand about courage. Courage is not the lack of fear. Courage is choosing to face fears head on because you have faith in something bigger than you. Sometimes we think those who are courageous don't have any fears, or they have found a way to get rid of fear. But courage is not the absence of fear, but choosing to push on despite fear. The disciples could have courage in the midst of a desperate situation because they could have faith in the God who created that storm. They could place their faith in God and have courage in the face of their fears. Courage, it comes from faith. It's not something you have to just muster up on your own. It's not a trait you are either born with or not. All of us can have courage if we will choose to have faith in the God of the storm. That day on the lake in Canada, it was somewhat easier to have courage because we faced that challenge together. We had faith in each other and in God who had called us to that moment. But other times in life, it can be much harder to be courageous. But the same God who got us through that storm and who got the disciples through their storm will be with us no matter what storms we might face in life. I would encourage you as you go into your small groups to talk about some of the fears that you struggle with and how you can choose to have courage by putting your faith in God, and in doing so, defeat that giant of fear. Thanks for coming, guys. We'll see you next time.